I parked my truck at the edge of the forest, the headlights cutting through the dense, shadowy trees. It was late, well past dusk, and the temperature had already dropped significantly, but I wasn't worried about that. I'd been camping alone in forests for years. There was something peaceful about being out here, just me and the sounds of nature. I had my gear, tent, food, a flashlight, a few books, and a couple of days to get away from the grind of work. I wasn't expecting much, just a quiet time to relax and unwind. The sun had barely set when I set up camp. The woods seemed to close in around me, tall pines standing like sentinels in the distance. As I prepared my dinner, I noticed how still everything was. There wasn't a single bird calling or a rustle in the bushes. It was like the forest had gone mute, and the only sound left was the faint rustling of the wind through the trees. I shook it off. Sometimes nature had its quiet moments, right? After eating, I built a small fire, the crackling flames providing warmth and light. I sat back on the log, watching the flames dance, feeling the heat on my skin. I thought about how easy it was to forget about the chaos of life when you were out here. The firelight flickered across the shadows, and for a moment, it almost felt like I was the only person in the world. But then, just as the last bit of light faded from the sky, I heard it. A faint sound, a footstep maybe, but too soft to be anything solid. My head snapped up, instinct kicking in. I'd been alone in the woods plenty of times before, but there was something unsettling about that moment. It was as if the forest itself had exhaled, a soft, almost imperceptible breath. I stood up, trying to listen closer. The air was cooler now, and the fire's glow was the only light I had. I strained my ears, but the sounds were gone. The forest was quiet again. Probably an animal, I muttered to myself, trying to dismiss the unease creeping up my spine. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It wasn't just the silence. It was the way the night seemed to press in around me. I glanced at my watch. It was only a little after 8 p.m., but the woods felt much later, the kind of late where you started to question what was real. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly circled the campsite, scanning the trees. My feet crunched softly on the dry ground, and the beam of light darted from tree to tree, from shadow to shadow. Nothing. No animals. No movement. Just the empty, oppressive darkness. I returned to the fire, trying to push down the gnawing feeling that I wasn't alone. But as I sat back down, I heard it again. This time it was unmistakable. A crunch of leaves, sharp and deliberate. I froze. Whoever or whatever it was close. Too close. The hairs on my neck stood on end as I slowly turned, shining the light in all directions. But I couldn't see anyone. The beam of light darted around the trees, landing on nothing but bark and shadows. The forest stretched out into the unknown, dark and thick. Whoever was out there was hiding well. I'd been out here for hours, and there hadn't been anyone else on the trail that I knew of. I was miles from the nearest town, no other campsites nearby. It was rare to run into another person, especially at night. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe it was just an animal. Maybe it was just the wind. But the crunch of those leaves, it sounded like someone stepping carefully, deliberately. My mind raced, but I didn't want to make a move yet. I sat still, listening to every sound. For the next few minutes, the forest seemed to hold its breath, and I began to think that maybe I'd imagined it. Maybe I was just being paranoid. The light of the fire warmed me, and I started to relax a bit. Then I heard the snap of a twig, loud and sharp, unmistakably human. I jumped to my feet, my heart racing in my chest. My breath came out in short bursts as I swung the flashlight toward the noise. The light flickered through the trees, catching the outline of a figure, a man. He was standing just outside the circle of light, too far for me to make out his features clearly. I called out, "Hey, who's there?" No response. just the figure standing still in the shadows. I didn't wait to ask again. I grabbed my camping knife from the side of my pack and held it in my hand, a feeble comfort. The figure remained motionless, and the longer I stared, the more I realized that this wasn't just some lost hiker. He wasn't moving. He wasn't responding. He was standing there, watching. A chill ran down my spine, and my instincts screamed at me to leave. But my legs wouldn't move. I felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot. The only thing I could do was keep the flashlight trained on him, watching as his shape remained perfectly still. Minutes passed. I couldn't hear any other sounds. No footsteps, no rustling leaves. Just my own breathing, sharp and quick in the cold air. But still, the man didn't move. He was dressed in a dark jacket and pants, blending into the night like a part of it. And something about the way he stood unnerved me deeply. His posture was unnaturally still. There was no shifting weight, no signs of life. He looked like a mannequin stuck in one spot. And then he moved. Slowly, deliberately, he began to step toward me. I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. He took another step forward, and I could see more details. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his face was obscured by a dark hood. But his eyes were wide open, dark and intense, fixed on me as if I were the only thing in his world. I felt the fear gnaw at me, but I couldn't look away. My brain was telling me to run, but my body refused to respond. My legs felt like lead, and then, in a blink, the figure lunged. I barely had time to react. I stumbled backward, dropping my flashlight. It bounced on the ground, casting an erratic beam across the forest. My heart skipped a beat as I scrambled to get away, tripping over my own feet. I heard his heavy footsteps behind me, growing louder, closer. I forced myself to keep running, adrenaline pumping through my veins. My head whipped around, trying to catch a glimpse of where he was. But all I could see were trees, thick and looming, offering no clear path to safety. The woods seemed to close in on me as I sprinted, each breath labored, my chest tightening from the cold air and panic. The man's footsteps were still there, following me, steady and sure. I glanced back, seeing nothing but the dark outline of the trees. The sound was getting louder, though almost right behind me now. I pushed harder, my legs burning, but my foot caught on a root, sending me sprawling onto the ground. I scrambled to my feet, panicking, but before I could get up, I felt a rough hand grab my ankle. A cold shock ran through my body, and I screamed, kicking out, desperate to free myself. But the grip tightened. I heard the man's breath, slow and steady, just above me. His voice was low, almost a whisper. "You should have left earlier." With a surge of panic and strength, I kicked again, my foot connecting with his chest. He let go for a split second, and that was enough. I sprang to my feet, lunging forward with everything I had left. The woods were no longer quiet. There was only the sound of my racing heart and the pounding of my feet on the forest floor. I didn't stop running, not until I hit the road. Only then did I dare to turn around, panting, my chest heaving. The man wasn't following me. There was no sign of him anywhere. I didn't care why. I didn't care how. I just knew I needed to get out of there. I jumped into my truck, slammed the door, and started the engine. The headlights cutting through the darkness as I sped away, the forest shrinking behind me. I kept driving for miles, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. The next morning, I called the authorities. They sent a team out to search the area, but they found nothing. No sign of the man, no tracks, nothing but an empty forest. I never went back to that spot. I never looked for answers. Some things you just don't want to know. But the memory still haunts me. His eyes, locked on me, unblinking, even in the darkness. And I can still hear his voice, cold and calm, telling me I should have left earlier. I won't forget the feeling that I was being hunted. I've spent most of my life working with wood. It's in my blood. My hands have shaped thousands of pieces of furniture, from antique chairs to sleek modern tables. But when my boss, Don, asked me to find some perfect wood for a custom piece, I knew it would be a different kind of job. Don's projects are always precise, but this one, it had an extra layer of secrecy. He didn't say much about what he needed, but the way he looked at me when he mentioned the woods, I knew it wasn't just about the wood. I grabbed my gear, basic camping supplies, chainsaw, measuring tools, and set off early one morning. The woods were about 2 hours north of the town, near a remote area called Pine Ridge. I'd been there before a few years back, so I knew the way. The road had more potholes than I remembered, and the trees grew thick, their shadows swallowing up the little sunlight that filtered through. It felt like time moved differently up there. I set up camp just as the sun began to dip. The smell of pine sap filled the air as I unrolled my sleeping bag and set up my small tent. It was a quiet night, too quiet. The air was still, and the usual rustling of leaves or calls of birds seemed absent. I chalked it up to the isolation of the place. Sometimes the silence of nature could feel unnerving, especially when you're alone. The first morning was clear and crisp, and I was eager to get started. I loaded up my chainsaw and headed deeper into the forest, the heavy scent of pine mixing with the damp earth beneath my boots. The place felt untouched. No signs of logging, no footprints from hikers. It was exactly the kind of place I had to find wood that would be perfect for Don's work. The kind of wood that only grows in isolated spots, far from human reach. I spent the day searching, marking trees with my knife where I found promising wood, straight, sturdy trunks with that deep, rich grain. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the air began to change. It wasn't just the temperature. It was the feeling, the sense of being watched, almost as if the woods themselves were aware of my presence. I shrugged it off, blaming my growing fatigue. The second night fell quickly, and I made camp earlier than usual. My fire crackled loudly in the quiet. I'd been spending so much time thinking about the perfect wood that I hadn't noticed how dark the sky had gotten. Even with the fire, the shadows seemed deeper than they should have been. It was almost like the forest was closing in around me. The breeze picked up suddenly, making the trees sway in a way that seemed off. I don't know how to describe it. Something about it felt wrong, like I wasn't meant to be there. I tried to push the thought out of my head and focused on my task. Tomorrow, I told myself, I'd find the wood Don needed. But as I lay in my tent, the sound of the wind howling outside became something else, almost like whispers. It wasn't enough to make me panic, but enough to make me uneasy. The night dragged on and I barely slept. By the third day, I'd found a tree that seemed perfect. It was large, tall, with deep grooves in the bark that spoke of age and strength. I started to set up to take measurements when I noticed something odd. The ground around the tree was disturbed, not from animals, but from something else. There were deep, claw-like marks on the earth, as if something large and heavy had moved through. My chainsaw buzzed to life, breaking the uneasy silence. I felt like I was being watched again, and this time, it wasn't just a fleeting feeling. I paused, letting the chainsaw idle as I scanned the trees. Nothing, but I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone. As I cut through the tree, the sound of the saw slicing through the bark was louder than it should have been, as if the tree didn't want to fall. My mind raced as the noise echoed through the forest. The whispers from the night before seemed to be growing louder, almost like they were coming from just beyond the trees. I quickened my pace, chopping at the trunk with more force than I normally would. The tree finally gave way with a mighty crack, falling with a thud that made the ground shake beneath me. I stood there for a moment, watching the dust settle around the fallen giant. But then I heard it, footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps moving through the underbrush. My pulse quickened. I was alone. I was sure of it. I grabbed my saw and made my way back to the campsite, but the woods had changed. The trees seemed closer, their shadows darker, as if they were leaning in. I felt like I was being surrounded, and the air grew thick, almost suffocating. The rest of the day passed in a blur as I packed up and got ready to head back. My instincts were telling me to leave, to get out of there before nightfall. But when I tried to start my truck, it wouldn't budge. The engine sputtered and died. I tried again. Nothing. The forest had trapped me. I wasn't going to panic. I wasn't going to let the woods win. I grabbed my gear and hiked to the nearest road. It was a good 5 miles, but it was the only way out. The air seemed to grow colder as I walked, and the footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate, grew louder with every step I took. By the time I reached the road, the sun had already set, and the woods felt like they were closing in on me, like I was being swallowed whole. I didn't dare look back, not even once. The footsteps were right behind me, too close. I made it back to town by the next morning, my legs aching and my mind in a daze. The truck started with no problem when I tried it there. I don't know if it was the woods, the strange feeling that had followed me, or if I was just tired, but when I got back home, I realized something. I hadn't brought back the perfect wood. I went back to my boss and told him about the trip, but I never mentioned the footsteps. Don just nodded as if he already knew. He told me to try again, to go deeper into the woods. I haven't gone back, but I can't shake the feeling that something's still out there, waiting. The rain had been relentless for hours, hammering down on the abandoned campsite. I sat huddled beneath a tarp, barely protected from the torrents that swept through the mountain pass. It was late October, and the air had taken on a biting chill. I'd planned this trip to reconnect with nature, to get some solitude and clear my mind. But now, the heavy rain and the eerie emptiness of the place made me wonder if I'd made the right choice. I had arrived earlier in the day, a bit too optimistic about the weather. The forecast had called for a chance of rain, but nothing that seemed like it would stop me from enjoying the quiet of the mountains. I had set up camp in a small, overgrown clearing just off the hiking trail, surrounded by thick trees. It was a perfect spot for a solo night, or so I thought. The campsite had been abandoned for some time. Old, half-rotted picnic tables lay scattered in the mud, their wood splintered and decaying. A fire ring sat at the center of the clearing, but there was no sign of anyone having used it recently. Felt eerie, like this place hadn't seen life in years. But the isolation, the quiet, was part of the appeal. I unpacked my gear and quickly set up my tent, hoping to get out of the rain before it soaked everything. The tarp I had strung above my cooking area was already sagging under the weight of the water. I tried to salvage it, but with the wind howling and the rain coming in sideways, it was impossible. My attempts to cook were fruitless, as the firewood I'd gathered was damp and wouldn't catch. As I sat there, waiting for the rain to let up, the realization set in that I was completely alone, surrounded by miles of wilderness. There were no other campers around, no cabins, not even a sign of wildlife. Just me and the storm. As the evening wore on, the sound of the rain became deafening. It wasn't just falling anymore. It was crashing against the earth, as though nature itself was trying to wash everything away. The occasional crack of thunder felt unnervingly close, like the sky itself was about to tear open. I tried to ignore the growing sense of unease. There had to be a logical explanation for everything. The abandoned site, the silence, the storm. But something about the place just didn't sit right. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't the only one there. Night had fully fallen, and the sky outside my tent was as black as ink. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning, followed by the growl of thunder. I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the rain patter against the canvas. It should have been relaxing, but with every gust of wind, every strange creak of the trees, my nerves got worse. I thought I heard something in the distance, something faint. It wasn't the usual sound of wind whipping through the trees. It was a different noise, like something scraping against rock or dirt. I paused, straining my ears. Another scrape, then silence. My heart thudded in my chest. Was it just the wind? Or was there something, someone, out there? I tried to brush it off, telling myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But the longer I lay there, the more the sound seemed real. A few moments later, I heard it again, closer this time. It wasn't wind. It wasn't an animal. Someone or something was out there. My skin prickled with the realization. I grabbed the flashlight beside me, turned it on, and unzipped the tent flap just enough to peer out. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating nothing but rain and trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I zipped the tent back up quickly and tried to calm my breathing. It was just the storm, nothing more. But the feeling didn't go away. The wind picked up again, making the trees moan and creak in a way that seemed almost deliberate, like they were trying to tell me something. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter around me, trying to block out the creeping paranoia that was taking hold of my mind. Suddenly, there was another noise. This time, a loud thud, followed by something heavy dragging along the ground. I froze, eyes wide. The sound came from just beyond the clearing, in the dense tree line. My mind raced. Couldn't be an animal. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. And then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. I held my breath, straining my ears for any hint of movement. Nothing, just the relentless rain. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Minutes turned to hours, and the rain never let up. The unsettling sounds from the woods around me continued sporadically, but I couldn't bring myself to investigate. I stayed in my tent, trying to convince myself it was just the storm playing tricks on my mind. Around midnight, the rain reached its peak. It pounded against the ground in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees with such intensity that I feared the entire forest might collapse. Then, just as I was about to close my eyes, I heard it again. This time, the sound was unmistakable. Footsteps. Not the light, cautious tread of a hiker, but the heavy, uneven steps of someone dragging their feet. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I grabbed my flashlight and slowly unzipped the tent, feeling the cold wind whip at my face as I peeked outside. There was nothing. The clearing was empty. But then my eyes caught something. A shadow, barely visible, moving just beyond the trees. I blinked, trying to make sense of it, but it was gone in an instant. Had I imagined it? I stepped out of the tent, heart racing, trying to tell myself that it was nothing. But then I heard it again, closer this time, as if the shadow had been waiting for me to step out. I didn't wait to see more. I bolted back into the tent and zipped it shut. My breathing was erratic, and I couldn't keep still. I had to leave. I had to get out of there, away from whatever was out there. But the storm was relentless, and I knew that even if I packed up and ran, the heavy rain would make it nearly impossible to find the trail. I was trapped. I tried to sleep, to ignore the growing fear that gnawed at my insides. But the footsteps never stopped. Every few minutes, I'd hear them again, closer, dragging, like someone or something was circling my camp. I had no idea what was out there. The only thing I knew for sure was that I was not alone. Eventually, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to find out what was going on. I grabbed my flashlight once more, determined to face whatever was lurking in the shadows. I stepped out of the tent and shone the light toward the woods, trying to pierce through the endless darkness and rain. The beam flickered, but there was nothing, no movement, no sounds. And then there it was, a figure, standing in the rain at the edge of the clearing, watching me. It wasn't a person. It was tall, unnaturally tall, its limbs too long and twisted in a way that didn't belong. I couldn't make out its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, as if it was studying me. My body froze, and I could barely breathe. The flashlight trembled in my hand, the beam flickering again, casting long shadows over the figure. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was paralyzed with fear, my entire body locked in place. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me with something that felt more like hunger than curiosity. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished into the trees, its footsteps dragging behind it, fading into the night. I stood there for a long time trying to process what had just happened. Was it real? Was I losing my mind from the isolation and the storm? I couldn't stay there any longer. The fear, the unsettling presence, I couldn't shake it. I packed up as quickly as I could, shoving everything into my bag and rushing to leave. My heart was pounding, my hands shaking. I don't know how I managed to find the trail again, but I did. I walked for hours through the rain, through the cold, until I finally reached the nearest ranger station at the base of the mountain. I never went back to that campsite. Couldn't. Whatever I saw that night, it wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could explain. And to this day, I still hear that dragging sound in my mind every time it rains. I had always loved the solitude of camping in the woods, but there was something about this trip that felt different. Maybe it was because I'd been going solo for the past few years, and though I'd gotten used to the silence, I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling creeping in as soon as I set up camp. My dog, Max, a large shepherd mix, seemed on edge too. He had been extra alert ever since we arrived. He kept his head low, ears pricked, and eyes scanning the trees, his body tense like he was waiting for something. We'd arrived in the national forest in northern Idaho late in the afternoon, after a long drive. I had picked this spot because it was remote and surrounded by dense woods, the kind of place where you can really get away from everything. I set up my tent near a small creek, knowing the sound of running water would be soothing as I fell asleep. But as the sun dipped behind the trees and the forest grew dark, I couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right. Max was by my side, pacing around the campsite, sniffing the air, and growling low in his throat. His growl was rare, but I knew it well. It was a sound that meant he sensed something unusual, something out of the ordinary. I tried to brush it off, telling myself that maybe it was just a deer or some other harmless animal nearby. But the woods felt too still. Even the wind had stopped blowing, leaving the trees quiet and unmoving. I started a fire to settle my nerves, watching the flames dance as they crackled and popped. Max stayed close, his body stiff, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow. I could feel the tension building, and I realized that it wasn't just Max who was uneasy. I was too. I pulled my jacket tighter around me, staring into the fire as it flickered. The sky darkened quickly, and I knew it would be fully night soon. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, too far for an animal like a deer or raccoon. This was something bigger, something heavier. The sound was distant, but it was enough to send a chill down my spine. Max's head whipped around, his eyes fixed on the trees across the creek. His growl rumbled in his chest, this time deeper, more urgent. I stood up, trying to calm myself. Maybe it was just a bear, or someone else camping nearby who was trying to set up for the night. But the rustling grew louder, closer. And then there was the unmistakable sound of something large stepping through the underbrush, snapping branches as it moved. I reached for the flashlight, but Max suddenly barked sharply, his body rigid with fear. I pointed the beam into the darkness, but all I could see was the black outline of trees and brush, swaying slightly in the still air. No movement, just the overwhelming quiet again. Too quiet. Then, just as I was about to relax a little, I heard it again. A quick, sharp snap of twigs, followed by what sounded like footsteps crunching the leaves on the forest floor. Max was barking again, and I could see his hackles raised as he started to growl louder. His focus was now locked on a spot beyond the campfire light, right at the edge of the woods. My heart pounded. Whoever or whatever was out there wasn't trying to hide. It was getting closer, moving slowly but steadily. I could feel its presence, like it was testing the boundaries of my camp. I grabbed the pocket knife I kept in my jacket and walked cautiously toward the creek. The sound of the rushing water filled the air, but it didn't drown out the heavier sound of movement from the woods. Max stayed close to me, his body tense, his fur bristling along his back. He was nervous but alert, ready to protect me if need be. He'd always been my protector, ever since I adopted him as a pup. Suddenly, there was a rustling right at the edge of the trees, so close that Max's growl became a furious bark. I shined the flashlight in that direction, but all I saw were dark shapes, nothing more. The feeling of being watched hit me like a wave, and my instincts screamed that I wasn't alone. The noise stopped. There was no more movement. It was as though everything around me had frozen in place. But Max wasn't fooled. His ears were back, his gaze still fixed on the trees. I moved closer to the fire, trying to keep my back to it. Max stayed near me, his presence a comfort in the midst of the unknown. It felt like an eternity had passed when, finally, I heard it again, the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. This time, it was right at the edge of the campsite. I turned, scanning the dark shadows, the flashlight trembling in my hand. My pulse raced as I watched the trees and brush carefully, waiting for something to appear. But nothing did. The sounds didn't stop, though. Whoever or whatever was still out there was moving around the camp, circling me. I could feel the weight of its presence in the air, like it was watching, waiting for the right moment. Max's growls were getting louder, more insistent. He barked again, and this time I saw it. A shadow flitting between two trees at the edge of the firelight. It was big, too big to be any ordinary animal. It had the shape of a person, but the way it moved, too fast and too silent, made it impossible to tell. I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. This wasn't a bear. This wasn't a deer. It was something else. My heart hammered in my chest as I scanned the darkness, trying to see it more clearly. Max lunged forward with a loud bark, and I jumped back, stumbling on a rock. The shadow was gone, vanishing back into the woods with alarming speed. My breath came out in ragged gasps. I was shaken, my whole body trembling. Max was still on edge, barking and growling, but I could see the fear in his eyes too. Whatever was out there, it wasn't natural. Then the rustling stopped. Complete silence. I stayed still for a long time, waiting, listening. And then, finally, I heard it. The unmistakable sound of someone or something moving off through the forest. The steps grew softer and softer until they disappeared completely into the distance. It felt like the world had come alive again, but I wasn't sure how to process what had just happened. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Was it a person? A hunter? A bear? But no animal or person had ever moved like that. It was like something was toying with me. I didn't want to stay here anymore, but it was too late to leave. I knew if I packed up now, I would be vulnerable. I looked over at Max, who had finally calmed down. His body still tense, but his growling fading. I sat down next to him, trying to gather myself. I knew that I had to stay alert, that whatever I had just encountered wasn't gone for good. It was hours before I could finally bring myself to sleep. Max lay beside me, his body still rigid, watching the dark. I didn't close my eyes for long. Every creak of the forest, every crack of a branch, kept me on edge. When the morning light finally broke through the trees, I packed up quickly, not bothering with breakfast. Max and I both felt the tension lift as we made our way back to the car. But the unease never left me. To this day, I don't know what I encountered that night. But I do know one thing: Max kept me safe. Whatever it was, it never came close enough to hurt us. I've camped in those woods since, but I never go alone anymore. Max, as always, is by my side. It was late in the afternoon when I finally hit the dirt road that would lead me to the campsite. I'd been planning this solo camping trip for months. Wanted to get away from everything, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the crackle of a campfire. No one around, no distractions, just me and the woods. It was the perfect escape. I was heading out to the Pine Ridge Forest, a place I had been to a few times before, but never alone. This time, I was going to go deep into the backcountry, far enough that the usual park rangers wouldn't be around. I didn't mind. I preferred being alone in places like this. The forest was dense, the trees tall and ancient, and the ground was thick with pine needles and old leaves. The road was narrow and winding, with the sun dipping lower in the sky, casting long shadows over everything. The farther I went, the more isolated it became. I passed a few turnoffs for nearby campsites, but kept going. I had picked a spot that wasn't marked on any maps, a place I knew from previous trips. No one else ever seemed to go that far. By the time I got to the edge of the trail that would lead me to the site, the last bit of daylight was fading fast. I threw my pack over my shoulder, checked my flashlight, and started on the narrow path. The woods around me were quiet except for the occasional rustle of something in the underbrush. I had been walking for about 20 minutes when I noticed something odd. It was a shape half hidden in the trees, just barely noticeable. I slowed down, trying to make sense of it. At first, I thought it was just another tree or a large bush, but as I stepped closer, I realized it was something else. A set of old, weathered camping gear, tents, sleeping bags, and backpacks, abandoned by the side of the trail. The gear was dirty, covered in layers of grime and dust, but it didn't seem too old. There was no sign of anyone around, but the site didn't look completely abandoned. Someone had been there recently. My curiosity got the better of me, and I cautiously approached the spot. I bent down, inspecting the abandoned gear. The tents were still partially set up, the zippers left open, as though the person had just left in a hurry. There were food wrappers scattered around and an old campfire ring, but the fire had long since burned out. I knelt beside one of the backpacks and looked through it, mostly finding clothes and a few personal items. Nothing that told me much about who had been here. I didn't know whether I should feel uneasy or not, but a strange tension started to build up in my chest. Something about this didn't feel right. Still, I shrugged it off. It wasn't uncommon for people to leave their campsites when they got scared or when things went wrong. I had done it myself before. I checked my watch, still plenty of daylight left, but the trees were thick enough that the shadows made it feel later than it was. The silence of the woods was heavy, and for a second, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. It was nothing, of course. I was just being paranoid. I decided to move on, thinking I'd report the abandoned camp to the rangers when I got back, though that wasn't exactly my priority. I was here for peace and quiet, not to be concerned about other campers. But as I started walking again, I realized I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The silence around me grew more intense, and the air seemed thicker, as though something was weighing it down. I pressed on, and after another half hour or so, I finally reached my campsite. I set up the tent quickly, then built a fire. The wood was dry, and it caught easily, sending flickers of orange light into the surrounding darkness. I settled next to the fire, grateful for the warmth. There was something oddly comforting about the crackling flames, like a shield against whatever might be out there. As the sun completely disappeared behind the trees, I sat back and enjoyed the stillness. There were no sounds except the occasional rustle of the wind through the branches. It felt peaceful, though there was still a part of me that couldn't shake the unease from earlier. I checked my phone, no signal, of course. I'd left that behind when I left the road. Felt better that way, but as the darkness thickened, I began to feel more on edge. I kept the fire going and decided to cook something simple for dinner, just to stay busy. I was stirring my pot of beans when I heard something, a faint rustling in the woods nearby. It was subtle, but it made my heart skip a beat. I dropped the spoon and listened carefully, but the sound stopped. I tried to dismiss it, thinking it was just an animal. But then the rustling came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the edge of the trees, but I saw nothing. My stomach tightened, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I couldn't just sit here. I stood up slowly and walked to the edge of the firelight, scanning the trees. The woods around me felt suddenly unfamiliar, as though the shadows were deeper than they should be. The rustling stopped, and I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I told myself I was just being paranoid, so I went back to my campfire and finished eating, but I couldn't stop glancing over my shoulder. Every time I looked into the darkness beyond the firelight, I thought I saw a figure standing there, watching me. But when I focused, the figure would vanish. The unease kept building, and I finally decided to get into the tent for the night. I zipped up the flap and settled into my sleeping bag, but I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the tent made my heart race. Every gust of wind made me wonder if it was something more. Around midnight, I heard a noise again. This time it was louder, a snapping twig, followed by a soft shuffle. Something was moving around outside my tent. I held my breath, trying to listen, but it was too quiet. Could have been anything, right? An animal, a bear. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. I grabbed my flashlight and pressed it against the tent fabric, shining it toward the noise. But nothing. No figure. No animal. Just the same dark, empty woods. Minutes passed, and I finally decided to check it out. I unzipped the tent and stepped outside, the cold night air hitting me like a slap. The fire was just embers now, and everything around me was shrouded in complete darkness. I scanned the area, shining my flashlight through the trees, but saw nothing unusual. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. Then, as I turned to go back to the tent, I heard a voice. Soft, faint, but unmistakable. It was coming from the direction of the abandoned camp I had passed earlier. The voice was too far to make out any words, but the tone sent chills down my spine. I froze, listening. The voice was gone, but the silence that followed felt heavier than before. I decided I'd had enough. It was too late to be this far out. I grabbed my gear, packed up the tent, and hurried back down the trail. The trees seemed closer now, almost as if they were pressing in on me. Every crack of a branch made me jump. Every rustle in the leaves sent my heart racing. By the time I reached my car, the first light of dawn was breaking over the horizon. I didn't care about the camping trip anymore. I just wanted to be gone. I didn't even bother to check the trail or the abandoned camp again. I started the car and drove back home, the whole time feeling like something was following me, watching me from the shadows. I never went back to Pine Ridge Forest after that, and I never figured out who or what had left that camp behind or what had been watching me that night. I don't need to know. I'm just glad I made it out alive. I had always been someone who enjoyed the quiet of the wilderness. That's why I decided to take a solo camping trip in the remote woods outside of Reno, Nevada. It wasn't the busiest time of year, late fall, when the air was crisp and the leaves had already turned to shades of brown and gold. The campground was sparsely populated, just how I liked it. There was a trailhead nearby that led to a secluded lake, and I planned on hiking there early the next morning. I set up camp late in the afternoon, picking a spot far from any other campers. The only sounds I could hear were the rustling of the wind through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. My tent was pitched, the campfire was crackling, and everything seemed peaceful. As night fell, the temperature dropped sharply. I sat by the fire, warming my hands and watching the flames dance. The air was thick with the smell of pine and the earthy scent of fallen leaves. I had a simple meal, a can of chili and some crackers before finishing off a bottle of water. The fire was slowly dying down, and the sky above me was an expanse of stars. It was then that I noticed something odd. At first, it was barely perceptible, but I realized there was something moving just outside the glow of the firelight. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The movement was slow, deliberate. A shadow, but no sound. No animal rustling through the underbrush. No footsteps on the dirt. Just movement. Something was out there, watching me. I stood up, trying to act casual, as if I hadn't noticed anything at all. But my body was stiff with tension. I walked to the edge of the firelight, peering into the darkness beyond. Nothing, but I could still feel it, whatever it was, there just beyond my reach. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I didn't have any weapons on me, just a small pocket knife that I kept for cutting rope or opening packages. I knew that wouldn't do much if whatever it was decided to approach. I grabbed my flashlight, switching it on, the beam cutting through the dark. I scanned the area slowly, nervously. The light trembled in my hand, sweeping over the ground, the trees, the bushes. There was nothing. I convinced myself it was just my imagination. Maybe it was an animal, something large enough to cast a shadow, but not quite visible in the dim light. A deer, maybe, or a bear. I tried to calm myself, sitting back down by the fire, though I couldn't stop my eyes from flicking toward the tree line every few seconds. It wasn't long before I began to feel the same strange sensation again. Something was off. A chill crept up my spine. My instincts screamed at me to pack up and leave, but I was too stubborn, too prideful to admit that I was scared. I decided to call it a night and climb into my tent. The warmth of my sleeping bag felt like a relief, but I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the feeling of being watched. Every crackle from the dying fire outside, every rustle of wind through the trees made me jump. I kept the flashlight beside me, just in case. The next few hours dragged on, the silence around me becoming suffocating. At some point, I drifted into a light, restless sleep, only to be jolted awake by a sound. A thud, followed by another, and another. It came from the direction of the woods, somewhere just beyond the reach of the firelight. The unmistakable sound of something heavy hitting the ground. Footsteps, maybe, or something moving through the leaves. My pulse raced, and my breath came quick. The thuds were getting closer. I couldn't tell if they were human or animal. I strained my ears, listening for any other sounds, anything to give me a clue. Then the tent shifted. Something pressed against the fabric from outside. I froze, my mind scrambling for an explanation. It could have been a branch, caught by the wind, pressing against the tent. But I wasn't sure. My instincts told me that wasn't it. The pressure didn't feel natural, like something was trying to push into the tent. The flashlight was still on the ground beside me. I grabbed it, but as I did, the tent suddenly jerked again, this time harder. It was as if something or someone was pulling at the fabric, trying to get inside. I shot to my feet, heart pounding, and unzipped the tent door. The cold air rushed in, and I could see nothing, just the thick dark of the forest stretching out before me. I shone the flashlight in every direction, the beam sweeping across the trees, the bushes, the ground. Nothing, but that feeling. It was still there, that unmistakable feeling that I was being watched, that something was out there, waiting. The sounds stopped as quickly as they had started. The forest seemed to hold its breath. I stepped cautiously outside the tent, the flashlight shaking in my hand. I scanned the ground, looking for tracks or any signs of what might be out there. But the ground was too hard, too dry to make anything clear. Then I saw something, barely noticeable at first, just a shadow flitting between two trees, a figure moving swiftly and silently, just outside my field of vision. I didn't wait. I grabbed my pack, shoved the flashlight into it, and started running. My feet pounded the earth, adrenaline flooding my veins. I didn't know where I was going, only that I had to get out of there, away from whatever was stalking me. The trailhead wasn't far, but the woods around me felt endless. Every snap of a twig beneath my feet seemed to echo through the forest, as if something was following me, just out of sight. My breath came in ragged gasps as I ran faster, pushing myself to move beyond the fear that paralyzed me. I didn't stop until I reached my car, panting and drenched in sweat. I didn't even think twice. I threw my pack in the back, jumped into the driver's seat, and sped off, leaving the campsite far behind me. I didn't look back. In the end, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been there, in those woods, watching me. Maybe it was an animal, or maybe it was something else. I don't know, but I'll never go back to that campsite, and I'll never forget the feeling of being hunted, of being alone in the dark, with something out there, just waiting for me to make a mistake. The sun had just dipped below the horizon as I finished setting up camp. The warm breeze still carried the smell of pine, and the sound of distant water splashing against rocks made me feel like I was miles away from everything. I had chosen a quiet spot along a lake in the Appalachian Mountains, a little off the beaten path, to escape the noise of the world. It was early fall, the kind of crisp evening where you could feel the temperature drop quickly once the sun was gone. I was alone, just me and my gear. I preferred it that way, even though some people found solo camping strange. But the solitude gave me peace. I didn't mind the quiet. In fact, it was refreshing. I had brought the essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, some dried food, and a small stove. I was planning on a simple evening of cooking up a quick meal and enjoying the tranquility. The lake wasn't too far from where I'd set up camp. The trees on the opposite shore reflected perfectly in the water, the calmness of the lake like a mirror. As I finished tying the final knot on the rope for my food bag, so nothing would get into it during the night, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It wasn't the typical feeling of unease that comes with being alone in the woods. It felt more subtle, like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone around. I brushed it off as paranoia, maybe because I had been alone too long or hadn't heard anything from the outside world in a while. No cell service, no notifications, just the crunch of leaves under my boots and the crackle of my campfire. That evening, I made a small fire, the flames dancing in the cool air as I sat by it, eating a dehydrated meal that tasted more like cardboard than food. But it didn't matter. What mattered was the silence, the flicker of light on the trees, and the fading orange sky, the peace that I had been seeking. But then came the noise. It was faint at first, a soft rustling in the trees behind me. I tried to tell myself it was just the wind, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic, like someone walking through the forest, careful not to make too much noise. I turned around, scanning the trees, but the darkness had swallowed everything beyond the reach of the firelight. I stood up, my heart beginning to race. My camp was isolated, and there was no reason for anyone to be out here this late. I had made sure to pick a spot far from the trails, but the rustling continued. I grabbed my flashlight and aimed it into the woods. The beam cut through the dark, revealing nothing but shadows and branches. Still, that feeling, that nagging sensation wouldn't leave me. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and my gut told me something was off. The rustling stopped, but I wasn't about to relax. I sat back down, keeping the fire between me and the woods, my eyes darting back and forth. I convinced myself that it was just a deer, or maybe some other animal. After all, this was the woods. Animals roamed freely. But as the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. I didn't sleep much that night. Every time I would start to drift off, a snap of a twig would jerk me awake. The quiet of the woods was now suffocating. I kept the fire going, feeding it small pieces of wood to keep the light strong. Every so often, I would turn to look into the trees, convinced I would catch a glimpse of whatever was lurking there. But nothing ever appeared. The next morning, I woke up with a headache. The night had been restless, and I didn't feel refreshed in the slightest. I packed up my camp slowly, trying to shake off the unease that still clung to me. As I was folding up my tent, I noticed something odd. The rope I had tied my food bag to was now on the ground, the bag nowhere in sight. I was sure I had tied it up securely. It was high enough that no animal could reach it, and there hadn't been any sign of disturbance the night before. But now it was gone. I checked the area around me the same way I had checked the night before, but this time there was something new: footprints. Not animal tracks, but human ones. They were fresh, the kind that only appeared in soft dirt. The prints led off into the trees, heading in the direction I hadn't been. I couldn't make out much detail in the faint morning light, but there was something about them that made my stomach turn. For a second, I stood frozen, my mind racing. Had someone been watching me last night? Had they taken my food? The tracks weren't far from where I had camped, and they didn't look like they'd been there for long. I followed the prints carefully, though my heart was in my throat. The further I went, the more the woods felt unfamiliar, oppressive even. The trees seemed to close in on me, and the air grew heavier. It was as if the woods didn't want me there. Eventually, the tracks stopped, not at a clearing or an open space, but at a large rock outcrop, the kind you find along mountain ridges. I couldn't see the other side of the rocks, but I had a feeling I wasn't alone anymore. That same sensation, the one I had felt the night before, returned full force. I slowly backed away from the rocks, my instincts screaming at me to leave. But as I turned to go, I froze. The sound of something shifting in the leaves behind me stopped me dead in my tracks. I didn't look back. Instead, I broke into a sprint, the underbrush scratching at my legs, my lungs burning as I pushed through the woods. I didn't stop until I reached the lake. I didn't even bother to check if anyone or anything was following me. I spent the rest of the day making my way back to the trailhead, keeping my eyes on every shadow, every rustle in the trees. I didn't stop until I was safely back in my truck, the engine roaring to life as I pulled away from the camp. Even now, months later, I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. The memory of those prints, the silence that seemed to press in on me, and the sound of something or someone moving just out of sight. I still don't know who or what it was, but I've learned to be more cautious in the woods. The world is vast, but sometimes it feels like there's something out there, just waiting for you to wander too far.